Good afternoon, everyone. Day 2 is almost over. I'm gonna entertain you for another 45 minutes, hopefully without anyone being talked into sleeping. So I got a really interesting subject with me, I think. I've been doing a lot of DevOps around CFML and Cold Fusion Lucy over the last, let's say, 18 to 24 months, last 2 years. And I thought I wanted to share some of that experience with you guys. First to maybe introduce myself. It's been a few years since the last CFCamp, so maybe some old familiar faces still recognize me. Maybe some of the new ones don't really know who I am. My name is Guust Nieuwenhuis. Fun fact, if you translate Nieuwenhuis from Dutch to Portuguese, I've been told it's Casa Nova. But anyway, I'm a managing partner at a small cool company called We Are North. We're based in Rotterdam, and we have a lot of experience on Cold Fusion, on CFML, but also on Java, DevOps, security, privacy. That's basically the thing we focus a lot around. We recently, with We Are North, about 2 years ago, we forked the last public open source version of Mura CMS and rebranded that as Masa CMS. And that's where we're currently one of the things we do. Alongside all the client work, we also maintain the open source CMS and work together with a lot of people using it to help them out and to make it even a cooler platform, a cooler CMS than it already is. I was born in the Netherlands, but I live in Belgium nowadays. That does explain why I do a lot of business in the Netherlands, but actually all over the Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and even internationally. And in my free time, I ride my mountain bike, and during COVID, I, by accident, became a UEFA licensed football coach, but that's a topic for at the bar. Environment variables in Docker containers. That's what I want to talk about today. And to give a bit of context, I was so happy when yesterday during the podcast recording, Mark Drew already mentioned 12factor.net, which is a really interesting website. If you don't know it, have a look. Go have a look. It's a methodology for building software, building web applications, and there are a lot of good concepts that you should definitely keep in mind when you build web applications. And this is the website. You can always have a look. The URL is at the top. And the 12 factors where they talk about are these 12. And the one I want to talk about today is the context of configuration. So the idea there is to store your config in the environment and make sure that that everything which is environment specific is dealt with in a way so that you could make sure that that's specific for the environment, but anything else which is not environment specific can move around everywhere you want to. And one of those things that you can then move around is those Docker containers, and we get to that later on. The thing we use for that, to do that, is what we call environment variables. And environment variables are variables whose value is set outside of the application, but it really affects the way the application behaves. And it's something which is not new at all. It's actually something from 1979. It was first introduced in Linux, Unix-based systems. A few years later, Windows adopted it as well. So it's definitely not specific to anything we do with Cold Fusion or with Docker. It's way wider, but there's a really, really good way to use that. To give you an idea, if I use my Mac and I go to a terminal and I type printf, then I get all the environment variables of my Mac printed out on the screen. You could do some other stuff as well. You could use printf home, and then you specifically ask, okay, give me the value for the environment variable home, and then it outputs that on your screen. Maybe some of you are a little more familiar with this syntax, maybe. If you echo with the $ home, that's another way. It basically does exactly the same thing, but it's this $ home thing that you could use, for example, in your batch scripts as well, if you're on a Unix, Linux system. There's definitely, I'm pretty sure, I'm not so familiar with Windows, but I'm pretty sure that PowerShell has the same kind of functionality. So you can have those environment variables individually. You can also bundle them all together in a file that contains multiple variables and have them all listed together. And then if you display that, you get something like this. This is the content of an environment file. This specifically is one you could use in a React environment with a couple of React configuration settings. So yeah, Docker environment variables. So now that we all know a little what environment variables are, let's talk about how we could use them in Docker and how we can leverage that power inside a Docker container. There are three things, if we talk about Docker at first, three areas where we could start using these environment variables. That's when we build a container image. That's when we run a container through the Docker run command, but also when we use Docker Compose, we could do a lot of configuration through those environment variables. I've got a first example here. If we use Docker to build a container image, you see the -- build arc. That's actually indicating that what follows are environment variables. And what we do a lot here, if we then build a container, then it does all the building that we're familiar with. You could pass on a hard-coded variable like that, a hard-coded value like that, 1.0, to indicate what a version number is. Another thing you could do as well, if you're in a Bitbucket pipeline, for example, is that you use an environment that exists within that pipeline, like a Bitbucket tag, for example, and that way within your pipeline, it takes the tag of your commit, which is running, which is tied to your repository, and takes that value and stores it in your container when building. So you could use those variables to basically pass on information on build. And then, of course, it does the same thing. In a Docker file, so if you do what I've shown here, and you pass on version, what you could do in your Docker file next is that there it is. If you use a Lucy Docker image, you could specify env version, and that way you set the version variable inside that container you're building. Why is that useful? What we do a lot with the setups that we have over at We Are North is that we run builds whenever a tag is added to a Git repository, and that tag is the version number of the application that we have. This way we take that version number in the pipeline and we store it during build in that image. Because if we deploy that image, and we'll get later to situations like that, the image has the version tied in, and it's not something that comes from outside on an environment. This is something that's specific to the image and will still stay the same on all the environments. That's why we take that value and we put it in the Docker image on build. If you want to play with environment variables at runtime, to say so, when you run a Docker container, this is the syntax you could use when you start a Docker container just in your terminal, for example. It's the -e and then debug equals 1. Basically, debug is the variable name and 1 is the value. And then it just starts up your container and you roll off. You're gone. So -e, the other thing you could do is also -env. That's the alternative syntax. Basically has exactly the same result. It builds your container and, it starts your container and it passes that value on to your container to use. Again, environment variable files. We saw that earlier on. You could also pass on a complete file with multiple environment variables configured. That's a lot easier. If you have 20 of them you need to pass, you don't want to put them all in a single statement you're executing. You could put them in a file and just reference the file. And then, so we talked about, okay, how do we deal with these environment variables whenever we build a container, whenever we run a container? But the other way of running a container, and what we do a lot, is use Docker Compose. And then when you use a Docker and Compose file, the way to add these environment variables is with this syntax. So you just have environment, and you specify your environment variable below the variable name and the value. Or, again, you use an environment, a file with all those environment variables, and then you reference to it as env_file and the path to your file. What is maybe important to specify and to highlight is that I've shown a lot of ways on how you can pass those variables. Docker has really nicely stated in their documentation, and yes, this is a copy-paste straight out of their documentation, on what the precedence is of those variables. So it will always first use what's passed on in the Docker run command in the CLI. So if you use Docker run in Docker Compose run in your CLI, then that's what gets looked at first. If not, it gets substituted from the shell, or it uses the attributes in the compose file, or it uses the environment files. This is basically the order in which it will look for it. And what's important here is that you can basically, if you play with this order, not change the order, but if you know what the order is, you can easily say, okay, we have a default configuration, but you can override based on your situation and maybe play with that in your setup. So let's dive a little deeper and a little bit more specific to CFML, what we're all familiar with, and let's have a look at, okay, how can we use those environment variables to configure an Adobe ColdFusion Docker image, for example, because the Adobe ColdFusion Docker official Docker images, they come with a few configuration options through environment variables you could use so that you could easily play with the configuration. These configuration options, they're all documented on the Adobe documentation. And I'm not going to go over every single one of them, because then the 45 minutes will be enough for this, but not for all the rest, which is about to come. But if we look at a Docker Compose file using an Adobe ColdFusion image for 2021, for example, and we specify environment, the first one we can pass, and we actually, it's not can, this is a required one. You have to pass this environment variable and say that you accept the EULA, otherwise it's not gonna work. It's probably gonna throw an error on startup. This is a required one. The next few options, those are optional. You can pass the serial number of your ColdFusion license just by putting the environment variable like this. You can set the administrator password. And you can, for example, also enable or disable, based on what you need, the secure profile of Adobe ColdFusion. And as you can see, if you have a Docker Compose, that's what we use a lot on local environments when we're developing. This way we could really specify everything. If I leave the serial number out, it'll automatically go and start in development mode. I can put the password in myself so that that's easily done, and so on and so on and so on. Let's have a look at Lucy then, because Lucy has a lot of those environment variables as well you can play with to configure Lucy. Once again, it's all coming straight out of the documentation. Lucy has a nice page where everything is described. There's a detail on every single one of the environment variables that's available, and you can have a look, see what it does, see what the values are you can pass on, and so on. But if we look a little closer to a few of them and have a look at, okay, what can we do, and what are some cool ones to play with? For example, Lucy has one, Lucy admin enabled. If you set it to false, the complete administrator is disabled, which is very useful if you're working on a production environment, for example. Locally, you want to set that to true so that you can actually play with the Lucy administrator. Some others, really cool stuff. If you're talking about the configuration of your Lucy instance, you can pass some values to the Lucy extensions environment variable. And what you see there is a UUID that references an extension. In this case, the JFreeshArt extension. You can specify what version you want as well. And what it then do, Lucy during startup will make sure that it installs those extensions so that you have those extensions available to you or not. The third one is a different one. A Lucy preserved case is like a setting. It's a setting you could change in the administrator, but instead of going in after an installation every single time and change that configuration, you could easily pass the value true for that, and preserved case in your structures will be set to true for your environment. And there are a bunch more like this. So these are only a few examples. There are a lot more. In the Lucy documentation, you could have a look at and see whatever works best for you. Something completely different, but also environment variables. And this is a cool one, actually. This is a snippet out of the Lucy server.xml file. Maybe some of you have already played with the XML configuration files. You could perfectly say, okay, I'll build a Docker container and I'll build an image, and during build of my image, I will take a customized Lucy server.xml and copy that into my container so that my whole configuration is set in there, which is a perfectly valuable option, a really cool one. But as you can see here, all my settings for my mail server are then hard-coded. And this is actually where we're going to. This is the problem we want to solve, because you would then build that image once, but you would have put a specific configuration in there. And what if that's the configuration for the acceptance environment? And then, okay, no, but we need a different configuration for production. So are you then going to go back and rebuild it with another configuration file for production? No, that's exactly what we want to avoid. We want to make sure that the container we build once, we can reuse it on all the environments where we want. One of the clients where we work with, if we have a hotfix that we need to deploy, we build the hotfix, we put it on the acceptance environment, we test it, and then when we want to put it live, we don't build it again. We take just exactly the same Docker image and we put it live. And we know that it's exactly what we've been testing on the acceptance environment. But to be able to do so, this is not going to work. Something really cool is that you can change these values in your Lucy server XML. And if you use this syntax with the brackets and semicolon and then your variable name, your environment variable name, these will be automatically filled out by Lucy on startup. So you can pass your configuration like that and then configure in the server XML using environment variables. There are a couple of contexts as well you could use in those files. They're documented all the way at the top of the XML file, but this is the way you can use environment variables. And I was super excited that they started talking about how the configuration is going to change to JSON. I double-checked with them. This will also be possible in the JSON file. So this is something that'll stay as an option. That's a good question. Not out of the top of my head. I'm sure. Yeah, yeah. Ah, okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. We have it with 5.3 containers running, so that'll definitely work. Yeah. Before, I don't know. Yeah. One of the other cool things, remember when we were looking at the options with Adobe Cold Fusion, they have this option to specify the password for the administrator, which is really useful if you're running with Docker Compose a local environment and you want to set the password for the administrator so you can have a look at whatever is going on over there. Adobe has that option. There's no environment variable for Lucy that does that, unfortunately. But what we do in certain cases is that we have our own environment variable that we call Lucy password. You could call it whatever you want. This is the name we gave it. And then once that value is passed, we have a Docker file that we use to build the image. And you see that we do the same thing with the version again. And if no version is passed, it will just put dev. It's a development version at that point. But one of the things we change is that we use an entry point batch script to start Lucy. And we customize that a little bit. I won't go too much into that detail, except to show you the insights, what's actually in that entry point batch script, is that we basically check whether that Lucy password environment variable is available or not. And if it is, which is in the else, we just echo that value into the password.txt file on the right location. And then Lucy automatically picks that file up, sets the password, and destroys the file. So this is a really simple hack around on how you could use an environment variable to pass on a Lucy password for your Lucy administrator. And as you can see by this, with the check whether it exists or not, the environment variable, we could easily, on a production environment, not pass it on, and then it doesn't detect it, and it just does nothing, and the administrator gives the nice message that a password needs to be set before you could actually use it. Even better is if you throw it completely out, but that's just a different configuration. So we looked at Adobe Cold Fusion, we looked at Lucy. Let's have a look at command box, especially because a lot of people I know are using command box in Docker, the Docker images as well. We've been using it a lot as well for our CI/CD pipeline, to run our tests, to dependency management, and so on. So once again, this time not in the documentation itself, but also on the Docker Hub. I hope you guys are familiar with Docker Hub. It's basically the website. It's a repository of publicly available Docker images. And every single one of those has the possibility to put like a really nice description of what the image does. And what most of the images have is that on that page they have a description of the available environment variables. And so does the Docker image for command box, as you can see here. And there are a few cool things you could do. For example, you could set the CF engine you want to use. If you pass on to the command box image that you want to use a Lucy 5, for example, this is the way you could do it. You could, of course, it's an option as well to specify the image and have a pre-warmed version of Lucy that you use. And the command box has the command box image, but it also has a command box version with Lucy pre-warmed, command box version with Adobe CF pre-warmed. That's definitely an option as well. But if you want to do it through environment variables, this is the way you could do that. The box server profile is definitely an interesting one as well, because you might definitely want to set that on a development environment to develop so that some of the stuff is not blocked off. The administrator becomes available, for example, when you set it to development. If it's set to production, you won't be able to reach the administrator, and it blocks off your tests, because it recognizes if you use test in your folder path tests, then it'll automatically block off the tests as well, so that those aren't available. So you could play with this profile to have some security, additional security or not. And we've been talking a lot about CFConfig over the last 2 days. You could easily pass on your configuration for your environment by referencing a config file. Best thing to do is to make sure that you put that config file inside the container on build as well, so that you have it available there, but you could reference to it. Another thing, which I don't think I documented, no, I didn't, but you could also you could do without the cfconfig.json file, and you can set a few individual parameters for CFConfig as well. That starts if you do CF. Is it somewhere on the screenshot here? Yeah, all the way at the bottom. If you look here, if you use CFConfig _ and then an engine setting, you can pass those settings as well on an individual basis. If you use the config file, then you pass the whole setup at once in that CFConfig JSON file. Yes?
Can I use an end file instead, where I put everything set an environment file?
Yeah. I think I showed that at the beginning. If you no worries, no worries. If you if you put environment like this, you specify the list of environment variables. If you if I remember it correctly, you put end file and then you have you reference an environment file where they're all listed. Yes. Ah, yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. That's that would be that would be awesome. Yeah. Oh, cool. I wasn't aware of that. Nice to know. We've been looking a lot at the different engines and the command box as a tool. So engines, tools, but let's look at some actual code. And first of all, I want to show you. Yeah, I explained all the way at the beginning. I'm involved with Master CMS now, but I wanted to quickly show you what the possibilities are with Master CMS. And this will eventually lead us to your own code. For those who use Master CMS, they might be familiar with the fact that there is a settings.ini.cfm file, which holds a lot of settings for Masa. And the file actually looks like this. It has reference to whether the admin has SSL enabled or not, whether auto updates are enabled or not, and way much more. This is the top of the file. I think Grant helped me out. How many different settings do we have in this file? Around 100, 150, something like that. It's huge. There are even settings that are not in the template, but that do exist and nobody knows about. So you suddenly discover them when somebody submits a bug report. What you could do with all these settings, if you just put Mura _ in front of it, you can then just use them as an environment variable with your Docker container, because they're all picked up, and Masa will read those and use them over the configuration which is in the code and set them correctly on start up of the application. Ben. Good question. Sometimes they are. Yeah, well, sometimes they are. It's case sensitive. And in some cases, and I think with Cold Fusion code, if you pass it on, you can, well, it doesn't really matter because Cold Fusion itself is case insensitive. But I was playing around with the Docker images for Cold Fusion. And what surprised me is that they are case sensitive. The rest of Cold Fusion isn't, but in their configuration. Sorry? Lucy is not. Good to know. Yeah. And if you were wondering, we're talking about Masa, and they all start with Mura _. We basically still have to rename this. It's one of the things to do, but not the highest priority. And we'll definitely keep it with Mura for a little while so that we have some backwards compatibility like that. But it doesn't work with the keyword Masa yet. That'll come one day. That leads us to configuring our own apps. So the trick is this simple server scope, the server scope. In the server scope, you have a struct called systems. In that struct, you have environment. And that's a structure that contains all your environment variables. So anything you've passed on as an environment variable is available in that struct inside your code. So to give you an example, we'll start with a Docker Compose file. We'll make it a bit more complex than the previous ones. We'll add a MySQL container so that we can run our database, use the latest version of MySQL. These are actually two environment variables for the MySQL container. You can set the root password, and you can set a database, and then that database is automatically created when the container starts. So you don't have to do create database anymore. It's there right at the start. And then we just add a Lucy container, and we pass on a few environment variables. We pass on what the type is, what the class is for the database connection, the connection string, the username, the password. There are a few variations you could play with. You could do it with the string, without the string. It depends a little bit on what your preference is, but this is just one example. And if we take that to our code, container is running, and you have the application.cfc. Inside your application.cfc, I think most of us will be familiar with the syntax to do this.data sources and define all the data sources we want to use in our application. And here we could just use server.system.environment.db class, DB connection string, basically whatever we defined in the Docker Compose, our own environment variables, we can pass them on like this, and that way we set it all up. Little disclaimer, if you're using Adobe Cold Fusion with version 2023, there seems to be an issue with this. There seems to be an issue with the whole this.data sources in the latest version of Cold Fusion. It's been reported they're looking at it, so I'm expecting they will fix it very soon. And then, so all of it that I've been showing up till now has all been with the Docker Compose file, and Docker Compose, in most cases, is what you run locally to spin up an environment. You share it with your colleagues. You're all using the same environment. But the Docker Compose file is not exactly what you would use if you would go to a production environment, for example. It could very well be. But what we do is we work a lot with AWS. And in AWS, we configure that in the task definition. And the task definition is the description of all the configuration of a Docker container that runs on AWS. And I got the task definition here. I use the interface to create that task definition. Next to the interface to create the task definitions, there are multiple other ways you could do that. You could use CloudFormation to automate that. You could use CDK to do that. So this is the easiest one to show you right away with interface. So if I recorded that, oh, is it going to start? Yeah, there it is. So this is basically what you could do if you create a task definition. You have a block over here. You see in the middle environment variables, and I take those environment variables from the previous example, and I just fill them out like this. Put the values in, and that way I define what my configuration is to run a Docker container on an AWS environment. While I'm filling out the environment variables individually, you see just below there is an option as well to add an environment, a file with environments variables like we saw before. So you don't need to do it manually like this. You could add the environment variables like this. And that's where it gets really cool with a setup like this. Once you start playing around with stuff like CloudFormation or AWS CDK, the Cloud Development Kit, you could leverage all the power of AWS, and instead of putting hard-coded values like I do here, you can reference a key in the secrets manager. You could reference to the parameter store, where you would save those variables in a more secure way than just in a configuration like this. Grant?
Is there any way to automate some of this stuff? Because this is always a sort of a failure point where you have to manually manage environment variables in your code with your sort of infrastructure. You have to make sure any simple spelling mistake can cause all sorts of havoc.
Yeah, yeah. 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 Yeah, it is true. One of the projects I work on, we have the complete infrastructure defined in infrastructure as code with AWS Cloud Development Kit, everything written in TypeScript. But yeah, you do have the situation if you have to put DB class in there and in the code, and if you mess up one of the two, yeah, of course it's not going to work. You'll figure it out pretty quickly, I suppose. But yeah, that needs to match exactly. That's true. But in your pipeline, if you play with stuff like that, basically the idea that we use is that during the build in the pipeline, we don't set those variables. We make sure that when we deploy, that's the moment where we pass all that information on, and it's been used inside the container and to be leveraged and actually to configure everything. Yeah. Any more questions? Let me think. If there's anything else, I can. No, I was thinking if there was anything else I could show, but not out of the top of my head. Ben.
At work, our security team is telling us now that environment variables are less secure to use, something like the key store
Yeah.
stuff. I don't know how seriously to take that though, because this feels pretty good.
It does. It does. Let me. It all depends on what you're passing on. For example, in the project I just referenced, we have everything scripted out. We have hard one of the values we have hard coded is the Java arguments for the JVM, and I should have added that somewhere as an example. You could the memory you give to your JVM inside the container, you can configure that with an environment variable that's automatically picked up. That's something that we hard code per environment in our infrastructure as code. So that does mean that if we want to change that value, we need to redeploy, but you need to redeploy anyway. If we're looking at the database and the database password, for example, what we do there, and this is slightly going out of scope, but in our infrastructure as code, we build everything, and we've got everything described the way we want. And part of that is that we have a description there of what database we want on RDS, what the properties are, and when it creates a database and sets all the values for the root password, for example, to give one example, or also the URL to reach the database, all that information during the creation we take and we store that in the secrets manager, AWS Secrets Manager. And then once we start a container, we read the value out of the secret manager and we pass it on. So we use a bit of both. There's a really good reason why you don't put everything in the secrets manager. We put the stuff in the secrets manager that's really secret. Other stuff that we want to be able to configure, for example, without a reload. One of the things, we haven't done it yet, but it's on our to-do list, is to create a value in the parameter store, which is a little less secure than the secrets manager, the parameter store in AWS. We want to set the value there on whether we want to enable or disable the Lucy administrator. And the password we already have there. But what we're trying to do is that we want to be able to go into the AWS console, change the value of enable administrator to true, then go to our environment and update the service so that it does a rolling update of the containers, redeploys them with the updated secret, and we don't have to do a complete redeployment. We can just change a setting and update it. The reason why we're not putting everything in the secrets manager is is cost. I think the cost of the secret manager is $1, if I'm not wrong, like around $1 per month per secret. So if you have 200 configuration options, which is maybe a bit exaggerated, but it goes really quickly, and that could actually mean $200 a month per environment, because the way we work, we have different AWS accounts for the different environments. One moment, I saw you had a question? You were putting your hand up a few times already during my explanation.
You mentioned that you are injecting secret manager password on start of the container. You are doing that in shell script or where actually?
In the task definition. Yeah, the task definition.
On build actually, or
No, on deploy. On deploy. And it's not that we, and it's not the task definition. We don't put the hard-coded value, we don't get the value and hard-code it into the task definition. No, in the task definition, you can reference the secret manager. And so then when it deploys with the task definition, it goes and gets it.
your Docker image, actual running image, don't need to access to secret manager.
No. You could do that. That would perfectly be possible, but that's not the way we went. No, it's not that secure. You could, to give some context, you could give your container that's running the rights to access the secret manager. And what you could then do is use the Java development kit straight in your code and go from your code to the secrets manager. But that's not actually, I wouldn't advise doing that. You, yeah. And one of the, talking about Secrets Manager, one of the reasons why the security team is so fan of it as well, is that if you open a secret in the Secret Manager, you don't see the values until you click a button, and when you click the button, that's put in the audit trail that you actually click the button. So you basically have the root MySQL password for the production environment. If somebody has access to the AWS account, everybody knows when, well, some people know when he clicked the button and saw the value. No, it's audit trail. So you had something? Okay. Anything else? If not, I want to thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, learned something, and if not, maybe had a confirmation of something you're already doing. That could be a good thing as well. And we'll see each other later on today.